Hello, my writerly friends. When it comes to writing, the fundamentals are key. No matter how advanced you are in the craft, it is always worth taking a moment to review the basics. And especially when you've been writing for a while, it's very easy to get stuck in your normal routine, your normal way of doing things, and that includes the point of view that you're the most comfortable with. So today we are going to review point of view basics, go over the common points of view and the pros and cons of each. Of course, this is great information for new writers who are really just digging into the craft, and for more advanced writers who are looking at different ways of telling stories and thinking about how to use different perspectives to tell each story in the most effective way possible. Okay, let's dig in. So the first point of view that we come across quite often is first person. First person uses the pronouns I and me, and it reads as though the protagonist, the point of view character, is telling you a story, like you're sitting around the dinner table and someone is just relaying events that have happened to them, or that are happening to them in the case of first person present tense. Now, the big pro with first person is that it allows the reader to develop a very intimate relationship with the protagonist. Because the point of view character is speaking directly to the reader about events that have happened or are happening to them, the reader is able to become very invested in this character. Of course, that's something that we're shooting for in all stories, regardless of point of view, but it can be more pronounced in first-person stories. Another really big plus of using first person, depending on the story, is that it creates the opportunity for an unreliable narrator. So because the point of view character is speaking directly to the reader, telling their story, the reader has no way of knowing whether this character is telling the truth or not, whether they're lying, deluded, and personally I love unreliable narrators. They create some really unique opportunities for plot twists. Now, the con with first person is that it is a little more limiting. It's not as easy to hop around and visit different characters as it is with, say, third person. So when you're deciding whether to use first person, it's really worth evaluating the scope of your story. If it's all very centered around one or two characters, then first person is likely to work a lot better. Okay, moving on to third person. Third person uses the pronouns he, she, him, and her, and third person books are written as though somebody is telling a story about another person's life. So there is an extra layer thrown in there, and that is the narrator. So with third person stories, we have the author who wrote the story, the narrator who is telling the story, and then the character whom the story is about. Unlike in a first-person story where the narrator is the character, the narrator in a third-person book may or may not be identified. One of the really great things about this is that it creates an opportunity to add some more depth and some more complexity to the story through that narrator's perspective, because the narrator may or may not feel the same way about the story as the author and or the characters. The narrator can have an entirely different perspective, and that really throws a wrench in things. The story that I go back to when I'm thinking about this sort of situation is Emma by Jane Austen. If you've read Emma, you know that the narrator, it's written in third person, and the narrator really has some animosity toward the protagonist, Emma. And the narrator kind of throws in these digs at Emma as they're telling the story about her. So if you're trying to color the reader's perception of the story or a character in a certain way, then adjusting the narrator's view on these things can help accomplish that. Another benefit to using third person is that it makes multiple points of view much easier. Typically, novels with multiple POVs that are written in first person are limited to 2, maybe 3, and these are generally in alternating chapters. So think about a romance novel. You might have the first chapter from one partner's perspective, and then the second from the other partner's perspective. and then they alternate after that. So it's pretty easy to tell who is telling the story at any given time because there aren't many options. But if you have, say, 7 point of view characters and you're writing it in first person, so they're all using the pronouns I and me, it's really difficult to orient the reader and let them know who is speaking. With third person, it's much easier to do that because you're going to be calling the characters by name. That said, one of the most common issues in third person works is head hopping. If you're writing in third person limited, which is the most common, you are in one character's head at a time. Even though a narrator is telling the story, the narrator does not know anything, and therefore the reader cannot know anything past one character's perspective. So say your point of view character is passing a stranger on the street, they might be able to tell that the stranger looks angry, but they wouldn't know that the stranger just got fired. And by throwing in that information, you're hopping into the stranger's head for a moment, which breaks that third person limited point of view and is known as head hopping. Now, if you do need to provide a lot of details about different characters at one time, then you would want to go with third person omniscient point of view, which is, as it sounds, omniscient. The narrator knows everything about everything. Nothing is hidden from the narrator, and therefore nothing is hidden from the reader. This can be really convenient, but it can also reduce the tension significantly because a lot of the tension and urgency that we feel in stories comes from the information that is withheld, the mysteries, the wonderings. Third person omniscient used to be a lot more popular. If you look, a lot of classic works are in third person omniscient. In modern literature today, you don't see it nearly as much. And if you do decide to use third person omniscient, I recommend you really take a hard look at your story and make sure that you're doing so because it truly enhances the storytelling, and not just because it's easier, especially if you have a tendency to head hop. So first person and third person are the most popular points of view to use, but of course they are not the only points of view. And if you want to get creative, you can try some other options. These can be especially fun in short stories when you're not locked into using them for long periods of time. And because they're so unfamiliar to readers, readers can also be more receptive to them when reading them in small doses. So another option is second person point of view. Second person uses the pronoun you, so it's like you are telling a story about the reader. So again, this can be really, really interesting in shorter works. I would not recommend doing this for a novel length work in most cases, but of course anything can be done, has been done, and if it's right for the story, then do your thing. Another fun one is first person plural, which uses the pronouns we and us. So it reads as though a group of people or a community is telling the story. Again, this is a rare point of view. A great example is A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. That is a short story, and if you have not read it, I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description box to where you can read that. So again, these types of points of views are super fun to experiment with, and I definitely recommend doing so. I think writing outside our comfort zone always makes us better and improves our craft. But if you do decide to use these options for novel length works, really think long and hard about whether it is truly the best option for the story and doesn't just seem like the most fun. And that goes for any point of view. Before you choose the point of view for your story, really consider what is going to be best for your manuscript. If you're not sure, I highly recommend picking a scene and writing it in first person and then write it in third person. That also works for tenses too. Write one scene in past tense and then rewrite the scene in present tense and see which reads better, which flows better, in which option were you able to get across the information that you need to get across in that scene. Now you'll notice that I said rewrite, do not just change the pronouns, and this also and especially applies to writers who are changing an existing manuscript from one point of view to another. Do not just change the pronouns because it's not the same. When you're writing in first versus third person, you're going to be relaying different details. You are going to be changing things other than just the pronouns. So I highly recommend, if you are switching from one to the other, take the time to go through and rewrite. So no matter how experienced you are in the writing craft, trying out different points of view is always a great thing to do. As writers, we're trying to expand our writing toolkit. We want different tools at our disposal so that we are able to tell each story in the most effective way possible. So I hope this was really helpful if you're considering writing a story in an unfamiliar point of view, or if you're just revisiting the whys of your current point of view. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to see more, and I'll see y'all next time.